What would you make you cross the threshold between submission and revolt? How many humiliations would be needed until the moment something inside you simply would break? Today I will tell a story that few know. But that has changed forever the scenario of tobacco plantations in the colonial Virginia. A woman who carried deep scars not just on her skin, but in her soul. Esther's case is not in the official books. It has been erased, hidden. But the marks they have left to this day in the shadows of American history. You will not believe what I found out about this woman who planned the perfect moment for her revenge for years. If you are interested in resistance stories that have been in the shadows, those that traditional historians have tried to erase, this is the right place. Stay until the end, because I will reveal details that have never been shared on how a single slave managed to destabilize an entire oppressive system with only one knife and an unshakable determination. The ruins of the Morland plantation still exist, covered by moss and purposeful forgetfulness, 16 kilometers from Richmond. The tobacco aroma impregnated in the aged bricks, the ghosts that roam the empty corridors. Those who pass by today can barely imagine the screams, the laments, the rush of the currents, the smell of blood. The old manor house with its worn steps and broken windows serves as a silent witness to the day the court was served during a banquet. In that main hall, now taken by vegetation, something happened that the region's farmers tried to hide for decades. A slave named Esther showed that even the most powerful are vulnerable when they face the fury of those who have nothing else to lose. Those who hold power believe he is protected by him, but history teaches us that no fortress is impenetrable when thirst for justice becomes greater than the fear of death. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Morland plantation stretched by 340 hectares of fertile land on the banks of the James River. A 3-story mansion rose imposing in the center of the property, with its white columns and tall windows that allowed you to observe the tobacco fields that stretched to the horizon. 27 wooden cabins housed the 93 slaves who moved that profit and suffering machine. Mr. Andrew Thornfield, widower, owner of the plantation, was known for his volatile temperament and his pleasure in displaying his power through exemplary punishments. The awakening happened even before the sun appeared. The slaves were awakened by the sound of the bronze bell, touched by Maxwell, a black foreman who had gained the confidence of the Lord at the cost of his humanity. The ground covered with wet straw in the cabins, the smell of sweat impregnated on the walls, the sound of the coughs that did not cease due to the constant work with the tobacco. Children were separated from their parents early on, trained for different functions. The punishment trunk was strategically positioned in the center of the property so that everyone could witness the price of disobedience. In the west shed, kept the key, were the instruments of torture, whips of different thicknesses, score, chains, rings. The gray sky of that region seemed to reflect the desolation of those arrested souls. The low clouds brought the omen of a storm that no one could predict. Among all the Morland plantation slaves, Esther stood out for his exceptional skill in the kitchen. A 27-year-old woman born in her own plantation, the daughter of a slave who had died in childbirth. Esther had learned the culinary secrets from an old slave named Ruth, who knew not only the perfect spices for each dish, but also the medicinal herbs and others less innocent. With skilled hands, Esther turned simple ingredients into sophisticated dishes that impressed even Mr. Thornfield's most demanding guests. His talent in the kitchen guaranteed him a different status. He could circulate between the slave world and the big house. He wore a less worn gray dress than the field workers' clothes, had access to ingredients, utensils, conversations. The other slaves trusted her to bring messages, small objects, news. The White Lord spoke in front of him as if it were invisible, revealing secrets, plans, weaknesses. Esther watched everything with low eyes and attentive ears. He knew every corner of the mansion, every drawer, every hiding place. I knew which floor tablets ranged, which doors needed oil in the hinges, which windows could be opened without a noise. Esther was paradoxical. Servant obedient in the eyes of Senhor, silent revolutionary in the eyes of yours. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The horrors of the Morland plantation followed a perverse logic of climbing. Andrew Thornfield believed that constant fear kept the order. The first offense resulted in public whipping, the second, on days without food on the trunk, the third, in the loss of body pieces, fingers, ears, cut noses served as a permanent example. Esther witnessed Sarah, a 12-year-old girl, to receive 15 spa for overthrowing a crystal tray. He saw Thomas, an elder respected by all, losing 3 fingers from his right hand for hiding a loaf of bread to his granddaughter. He witnessed little Daniel to be sold, separated from his mother Abigail, who raised in pain for 3 days until he lost his voice completely. With each atrocity, Esther's face remained impassive, his eyes low, his hands busy with his tasks. But inside, something changed. Each scream of pain was recorded, each tear spilled, accounted for, each injustice filed in an inner court that would once submit its sentence. The breaking point came when Ruth, the old man who had taught everything to Esther, got sick severely. At 72, the old cook developed a persistent fever that prevented her from working. Esther begged Mr. Thornfield to make it possible to take care of her, promising to compensate for their work. The answer came in the form of an order. Ruth, unproductive, would be left in the cabin without assistance until she recovered or died. For 3 days, Esther was divided between the kitchen of the big house and sneaks to the cabin where Ruth was off. At dawn on the 4th day, when she finally got some medicinal herbs to prepare tea, she found Ruth killed on the straw mattress. Her cold body, open eyes fixed on the door, as if she had expected until the last moment for the help that did not arrive on time. Esther washed the thin body of the elder, fought her white hair with colorful tapes she had hidden for years, sewed a small bag of herbs that put it by the woman's chest that had been her only family. In the hasty burial, allowed only to dawn so as not to delay the work in the fields, Esther did not pour a tear. He just touched the earth over the shallow grave and took a silent oath that sealed everyone's fate in the Morland plantation. The cruelty in the plantation had many faces. Andrew Thornfield, with his whip always at hand, was just the most visible manifestation. There was Maxwell, the black foreman who wiped more vigorously than the white overseers, as if each scam against his equals would remove him from his own condition. Reverend Phillips, who visited the plantation fortnightly to preach about obedience and acceptance of fate, while ignoring the wounds exposed from the forced faithful to assist their sermons. Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, Thornfield's widowed sister, who had come to live in the mansion and had fun testing new discipline techniques, especially against younger women who could arouse her brother's interest. However, the event that served as the final catalyst came from outside. James Wellington, a rich Richmond merchant and the leading buyer of Westmoreland tobacco, arrived for his semi-annual visit bringing with it a novelty, a stunned papier with small pieces of metal intertwined on leather straps, which promised to break the tougher stubbornness. To demonstrate the effectiveness of the instrument, Thornfield ordered them to bring Isaac, a 16-year-old accused of looking straight at Mrs. Sullivan. Esther, serving drinks on the porch, witnessed the moment when the new whip opened the boy's back as butter, blood sneezing her white apron, while men argued excitedly the merits of the instrument. Wellington promised to order a dozen of them, straight from London as a gift to strengthen the commercial partnership. At that moment, Esther learned that the time to wait was over. 2 weeks after Ruth's death, Esther made his first deliberate mistake in years of impeccable service. As he served the afternoon tea to Andrew Thornfield and his sister in the garden, he dropped the English porcelain tray that had belonged to the late wife of the Lord. The reaction was immediate. Thornfield ordered all the house slaves to be gathered to witness the punishment. In the center of the stone courtyard, under the case of August, Esther was tied to the post of punishment. His gray dress was torn to the waist, exposing his back to the newly admitted whip. Maxwell applied 20 whip, told aloud by Thornfield. With each blow, pieces of skin were detached, revealing the alive flesh underneath. Esther did not emit a single sound. Your eyes remained open, the fixed at a distant point, as if his spirit were already far from there. The silence of the slave enraged Thornfield, who ordered 5 more blows. When they finally released her, Esther fell to his knees, his back transformed into a pain screen, Eleanor Sullivan approached a jar of vinegar and salt, pouring the liquid over the open wounds to avoid infections, while smiling at the spasm of agony that finally ripped a moan from Esther's throat. That night, lying on his stain on dirty straw in the sick cabin, something definitely changed inside her. The pain has become clarity. Fear gave way to the decision. Resignation became in purpose. Esther would not be the same again. For the next 2 months, while their wounds healed, leaving rude marks that would never disappear, Esther elaborated every detail of her plan. The first to be recruited was Abigail, who had never recovered from the sale of his son, and whose empty look hid a latent anger. Then Samuel, a skilled carpenter who had access to tools and knew every corner of the property for helping to build many of the structures. Finally, twins Isaiah and Joseph, strong young people who worked at the stable and could move more freedom by property. Each has only received fragments of the plan, never complete vision, a precaution against possible denunciations. Esther designated specific tasks. Abigail would be responsible for distracting Eleanor Sullivan at a crucial time. Samuel would create hiding places for the few belongings that would lead and prepare an escape route from the back of the property. The twins would guarantee sealed and strategically positioned horses for the escape. Esther herself, now back to the kitchen, but with scars that resembled everyone the price of disobedience, took care of the central and most dangerous part of the plan. The perfect opportunity came when Andrew Thornfield announced a large feast for October 17, 1787, when he would celebrate his 50 years and receive the main farmers and traders in the region, including the governor of Virginia. The occasion, which Thornfield called Celebration of Prosperity, would be the stage for Esther's final act. The countdown began, 46 days. Each eight-finker brought Esther closer to his goal. On the eve of the banquet, the West Morland plantation boiled with activities. At Casa Grande, house slaves ran to polish the silver, airing the best sheets for guest rooms, preparing floral arrangements. In the main hall, candelabros were clean, the polished wooden floor until shine, the best dishes organized on the elongated table to accommodate 24 guests. In the back of the mansion, the kitchen had become the epicenter of the agitation. Huge pieces of meat baked slowly. Sauces bubbled in copper pots. Fresh vegetables awaited the moment of being prepared. Esther coordinated everything with a cold calm that hid the inner storm. His hands moved with usual accuracy as his mind passed every detail of the plane. At dusk, while carriages began to arrive bringing their first guests, Esther met briefly with their accomplices in the storage shed, under the pretext of seeking more spices. The exchange of looks was the only sign. Each one knew his part. Samuel quickly showed the escape route he had prepared through a little used passage in the property's backgrounds. The twins confirmed that 3 horses would be ready, tied behind the smaller barn. Abigail discreetly squeezed Esther's hand, his touch communicating both fear and determination. While the violin's music began to sound in the big house and the laughter of the guests echoed, Esther returned to the kitchen. Under his apron, stuck at the waist by a fabric strip, was the knife that had belonged to Ruth, the sharpest kitchen blade, now with the cable wrapped in cloth to prevent it from slipping, even with sweaty hands or wet with blood. At 9 o'clock in the evening of October 17, 1787, the main hall of Westmoreland Mansion shone in the light of 52 candles. 23 guests took their seats at the table with Andrew Thornfield at the head, displaying a satisfied smile. Dinner followed its natural course. The soup of peas with smoked ham had already been served and removed. The fish and herbal sauce had given way to the first main course, baked pink with red fruit sauce. Esther moved by the hall as an efficient shadow, filling glasses, removing dishes, coordinating the other servants with discreet gestures. The guests barely noticed their presence, except when Eleanor Sullivan called her aloud to correct some irrelevant detail of the service, a form of public humiliation that drew smiles from the gift-ess. At 9:27, Abigail executed his part of the plan, accidentally knocking down a glass of red wine over Mrs. Sullivan's silk dress, which immediately stood up, dragging the servant out of the hall to teach her good manners. The moment of distraction had arrived. Esther approached the headboard to serve more wine to Thornfield, who was talking excitedly with the governor about that year's record profits. Including between the 2 men with the bottle in hand, Esther allowed himself for the first time in years to look straight into his lord's eyes. Thornfield, surprised by boldness, frowned. That's when he recognized something in the eye of the slave. Not submission, not fear, but a cold and irrevocable judgment. Before he could react, Esther dropped the bottle and, in a fluid movement, drew the knife of his hiding place. The blade crossed Thornfield's chest accurately, penetrating between the ribs directly in the heart. The man widened his eyes, more of surprise than pain. "This is by Ruth," Esther whispered, so low that only he could hear. While the guests still processed the surreal scene, Esther turned the knife and pulled her out. The blood splashed, staining the white linen towel, the governor's silk shirt, the lady's dress sitting right. Thornfield tried to speak, but only a red bubbling escaped his lips before he collapsed on the table, knocking on cups and dishes. The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds before chaos exploded in the hall. As shouts echoed through the mansion and guests ran in panic, Esther moved by the determination of those who had mentally rehearsed each step thousands of times. Taking advantage of the initial confusion, he went to the nearest exit as expected, but to Thornfield's office. There, as planned, he found Samuel waiting. The carpenter had already opened the built-in vault on the wall, knew his construction, because he had been who he had installed it years before. From within, he removed the documents they sought. Records of slave ownership, including those who had been sold to other plantations. Esther quickly found the sale record of little Daniel, son of Abigail, for a plantation in North Carolina. It was the information they needed to, perhaps one day, try to recover the child. Samuel kept the papers in a waterproof leather bag. Together, they went to the back, where Abigail was already waiting for them, panting after escaping Eleanor Sullivan, taking advantage of the commotion. The three crossed the property through a passage between shrubs that Samuel had discreetly prepared for weeks, gradually cutting off branches and creating an invisible route for anyone who knew where to look. At the combined point behind the smaller barn, they found the twins Isaiah and Joseph with the ready horses. The darkness of the moonless night became his ally. Before they left, however, Esther had one last ritual to fulfill. He withdrew a small bag of fabric from the dress that contained dry herbs, the same that Ruth had taught him to recognize, and a white strand of hair that had cut from the elder before burial. From another pocket, he took a piece of coal that robbery from the kitchen, protected by several layers of damp fabric. With precise gestures, he lit herbs, which began to burn slowly, releasing an aromatic smoke. Esther raised the little improvised fire toward the mansion, now taken by the chaos of shouts and lights in motion, and spoke words in a language that his mother had taught Ruth, and Ruth to her, words of liberation, passing, breaking invisible currents. The five then fled, Esther and Abigail on one horse, Samuel in another, the twins sharing the third. They headed north, where free black and abolitionist communities could offer shelter. Behind them, in the West Morland plantation, other small bonfires began to emerge. Slaves that were not part of the original plan, but understood that that night represented a unique opportunity. Before dawn, 5 huts were empty. 23 people had disappeared in the darkness, forming a silent column towards the uncertainty of freedom. The news about the murder of Andrew Thornfield and subsequent slave escape spread as fire through Virginia. Official reports described the event as an act of unprecedented savagery and evidence of the treacherous and ungrateful nature of blacks. Alarmed letters circulated among plantations, warning of the danger of allowing slaves to occupy positions of trust in residences. The governor authorized special patrols to hunt fugitives by offering substantial rewards. In the following months, similar cases began to emerge in other regions. Do not bake direct senatos such as Thornfield's, but calculated acts of resistance. In a plantation in the neighboring county, all the horses dawned dead, poisoned, the same day an important entourage should arrive. In another property, a few kilometers from Richmond, the main well was contaminated, causing a mysterious disease that only affected the owner's family. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Actions seemed to focus around the kitchen, food, poisoning. Farmers began to fear their own meals. What was once a symbol of power being served by slaves became a source of anxiety. At the secret meetings of the fugitive hunting patrols, a name was whispered with a mix of anger and fear. Esther's method. For owners, it represented the nightmare of domestic betrayal. For slaves, it became a symbol of hope-proof that even the most powerful could be vulnerable. For 8 months, Esther and his group managed to stay ahead of the persecutors, moving constantly, avoiding main roads, receiving occasional help from white abolitionists and free black communities. They crossed rivers, slept in caves, faced the harsh winter in abandoned barns. Samuel died in February, victimized by pneumonia that could not treat properly. Joseph was captured in March during an incursion to get food, tortured to death without revealing the whereabouts of others. In early June 1788, the reduced group, Esther, Abigail, and Isaiah, was finally cornered by a 12-man patrol near the Pennsylvania border. The persecution culminated in a confrontation on the bank of the Susquehanna River. Isaiah tried to create a distraction to allow women to escape, but was shot down with 2 shots. Abigail managed to cross the river, his final destination remaining unknown. Some later reports suggest that she eventually reached Canada and, years later, was able to locate her son. Esther, exhausted and injured after months of escape, was captured alive, a triumph for hunters, who received specific instructions not to kill her. They wanted to make her an example. During the transport back to Virginia, chained and under constant vigilance, Esther remained in absolute silence. Neither supplications nor threats, no preliminary torture have pulled a single word from their lips. Only when they reached the limits of the Morland plantation, now administered by a distant cousin of Thornfield, Esther finally spoke. As they dragged her to the center of the property, where a scaffold had been specially built for her public execution, she raised her head and pronounced clearly, "Look at your dishes before eating. Look at your drinks before drinking. We are everywhere. We watch. We look." His last words, reported by reluctant witnesses, became a warning that would haunt generations of slave owners. Esther's execution on June 23, 1788 was assisted by owners of plantations of 3 different counties, brought especially to witness the fate reserved for rebel slaves. None of the Westmoreland plantation slaves were allowed to witness the event. More escapes were feared, or even a rescue attempt. Esther's body remained exposed for 3 days as a warning. On the 4th day, when guards went to remove it to bury it in an unmarked place, they found that at night someone had covered the corpse with wild flowers and aromatic herbs, a respect ritual that no one could explain how it was performed without being detected. In the following years, stories about Esther began to circulate among slave communities. Reports of his courage have become coded songs, sung in the fields during work. The knife he had used to kill Thornfield was never found. It was said that it had been passed on, from planting and planting, like a sacred relic. On new moon nights, slaves whispered that they could see a woman's silhouette crossing the tobacco fields, inspecting the kitchens, watching the oppressors. Official historians tried to erase the incident of the records, reducing it to a footnote about slave agitation or omitting it completely. But memory persisted in the oral tradition. Decades later, during investigations into the Civil War, researchers discovered mentions to a kitchen code among domestic slaves, secret resistance practices inspired by the Esther method. Some argue that Esther's most lasting legacy was not the murder itself, but the climate of distrust that settled between gentlemen and domestic slaves, undermining one of the fundamental pillars of the slave system. Illusion of and forced loyalty. To this day, near the ruins of Westmoreland, local residents report that on especially silent October nights, it is possible to hear the tillery of cutlery and the muffled sound of steps in the old kitchen, as if a ghostly feast continued forever, with Esther serving his final justice repeatedly through the centuries. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Esther's story touched her heart. Share so that Esther's memory is never forgotten.